The mud sucked at her bare feet. It was a cold, greedy thing, this mud. It clung to her skin, a constant reminder of where she stood in the world. At the bottom. Tessa's world was the mud, and the leaky roof of the Omega barracks, and the gnawing ache in her belly that never quite went away. Survival was a game of shadows. To be seen was to be a target. So she learned to be invisible. She learned to make herself small, to keep her eyes down, to be as quiet and forgettable as a stone at the bottom of a river. Today, the game was harder than usual. The air was thick with a biting wind that promised a storm, and the betas were restless, which meant the alphas were on edge. And when the alphas were on edge, the omegas paid the price. "Move it, filth!" The voice was a whip crack. A beta named Kian, broad and scarred, shoved past her. His shoulder sent her stumbling sideways, and her morning's meager prize, a small, slightly stale loaf of bread, tumbled from her grasp and landed squarely in the deepest part of the puddle. Kian didn't even look back. He just laughed, a cruel, barking sound. Her stomach clenched. Not with anger. Anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. It was just a hollow ache, a familiar resignation. Of course. She didn't know what was worse, the hunger or the humiliation. Truth be told, she bent down, her thin fingers plucking the ruined bread from the gritty water. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't waste it. She would eat it later, mud and all, because that's what it took to see the next sunrise. She tucked the wet lump into a fold of her tunic, her movements small and practiced. Invisible. Deep down, she knew the truth. This wasn't living. It was waiting. Waiting for the end. She looked up, past the imposing stone walls of the main citadel where the ruling Alpha, Lord Vorlag, lived. Her gaze drifted to the tree line, to the dark, forbidden expanse of the Whispering Woods. Omegas weren't allowed there. Legends said old spirits haunted the trees. But sometimes she wondered if the spirits were any crueler than the wolves inside the walls. What would it be like to just walk away? To disappear into the trees and never come back? It was a stupid thought, a dangerous one. And she pushed it down, back into the quiet, dark place where she kept all her impossible dreams. The sky rumbled, a low growl that mirrored the ones she heard from the guards every day. A storm was coming, a bad one. She just had to get through the day. That's what she always told herself, just this one day. But as the first cold drop of rain hit her cheek, a shiver traced its way down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Maybe it was fate, but something felt different today. Something was about to break.
Pain. It was the first thing he knew. A searing, white-hot fire that licked along his ribs, his shoulder, his leg. Every breath was a fresh agony. The second thing he knew was rage. A pure, black, volcanic fury that was the only thing keeping him conscious, the only thing keeping him moving. Vorlag. The name was a curse on his tongue. A name that used to mean brother, friend, second in command. Now it meant traitor, usurper, murderer. His mind flashed with images, sharp, jagged shards of memory. Vorlag's face not angry, but bored. An almost casual cruelty in his eyes as his men, their men, had turned on him. "The pack needs a strong hand, Aldrich," Vorlag had said, his voice smooth as poisoned silk. "Not a soft heart." Then the blades had come out. He stumbled, his shoulder crashing into the rough bark of an ancient oak. His blood, so much blood, stained the forest floor. He was the Alpha King. Or he had been. Now he was just prey, running through his own lands like a common rogue. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth, worse than the blood. He had built this pack on principles of honor and strength, not the brute force Vorlag championed, but the true strength of loyalty, of unity. What a fool he'd been. A growl tore from his chest, low and feral. It was his wolf, the great black beast that was the soul of his kingship, pushing him forward. Move, survive, avenge. The mantra beat in his head with every ragged beat of his heart. He had to live. He had to live to reclaim his throne, not just for himself, but for the pack members who would suffer under Vorlag's tyranny. Because of that, he couldn't die here, not like this. He could feel them. The trackers. Vorlag would have sent his best. They wouldn't stop until they had his head. He pushed off the tree, his legs trembling with exhaustion. The sky had opened up, a torrential downpour that was both a blessing and a curse. It would wash away his scent, but the cold, the bone-deep chill was stealing what little strength he had left. Through the trees, he saw a faint light, a flicker of warmth in the deepening gloom. The Omega quarters, the mud quarters, the lowest, most forgotten part of his own settlement. No one would ever think to look for him there. It was beneath notice, beneath contempt. It was perfect. His body moved on instinct, a desperate final lurch toward the light. He cleared the tree line, the world swimming in a gray, watery haze. He saw the dilapidated barracks, the shuttered windows, and then his legs gave out. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him whole was the muddy ground rushing up to meet him.
The storm hit like a fist. Rain came down in solid, blinding sheets, turning the world outside the barracks into a churning sea of mud and misery. Inside, it wasn't much better. The roof leaked in a dozen places, and the other Omegas were huddled together, their fear a palpable thing in the cramped space. Storms made the guards mean. Tessa sat apart, as always, gnawing on her soggy bread. The taste of dirt was familiar. Then, a flash of lightning lit the world in stark white. And in that brief, brilliant moment, she saw it. A shape. A man, lying face down in the mud just beyond their door. A collective gasp went through the room. "Don't look," an older Omega named Alara whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't see it. Getting involved is a death sentence." And one by one, the other women turned away. They shuttered their faces, pulled their thin blankets tighter. They made themselves blind. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do, the Omega way. Tessa tried. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't look away. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Her mind screamed at her, "Look away! He's not your problem! You have to survive!" But then another flash of lightning illuminated him. He was covered in blood. So much blood. It was a dark stain spreading in the rain-soaked earth around him. He wasn't moving. She didn't know what scared her more, the thought of the guards finding her with a stranger or the thought of leaving him to die alone in the cold and the rain. Her whole life, she had followed the rules. Be quiet. Be invisible. Survive. But looking at him, something inside her shifted. A reckless, dangerous spark of the compassion she always tried to smother. Without thinking, her body moved on instinct. "What are you doing?" Alara hissed, her eyes wide with terror as Tessa rose to her feet. Tessa didn't answer. She couldn't. Her feet carried her to the door, her hand trembling as it reached for the latch. She opened it just a crack. The wind tore at her, whipping her hair across her face, but her eyes were fixed on the fallen man. Deep down, she knew the truth. This was a mistake. A terrible, fatal mistake that would probably get her killed. And she let it happen. Before she could lose her nerve, she slipped out into the raging storm, the icy rain a shock against her skin. The door creaked shut behind her, sealing her out with the dying man and her own foolish, bleeding heart. The rain was a wall, the wind was a scream, and the man at her feet was a dead weight, an anchor pulling her down into a world of trouble she couldn't possibly imagine. Her first thought was pure, stupid panic. What have I done? But then a low groan escaped his lips, a sound of such profound agony that it cut right through her fear. In that moment, he wasn't a problem. He was just a person who was dying. Her body moved on instinct. She grabbed him under the arms, her fingers digging into the cold, wet leather of his tunic. He was heavy, impossibly so, all lean muscle and solid bone. She pulled, her bare feet sliding in the mud, her muscles screaming in protest. It was like trying to move a mountain. For a terrifying second, she thought she couldn't do it, that they would both be found right here, a pathetic tableau of foolishness and death. But then, she remembered the root cellar. It was an old, forgotten space beneath the barracks, its entrance hidden under a loose floorboard in the back corner where no one ever went. The elders said it was haunted, which meant it was the safest place in the world. With a surge of adrenaline, she heaved. One step, then another. She dragged him across the muddy ground, the sound of his body scraping against the earth lost in the howl of the storm. It felt like an eternity, but moments later, she had him inside the blessedly dark barracks. The other Omegas were silent, their faces turned to the wall. They saw nothing. They knew nothing. Because of that, she was alone in this. She wrestled the floorboard up, revealing a black, gaping hole that smelled of damp earth and old roots. With the last of her strength, she half lowered, half dropped him into the darkness. He landed with a heavy, sickening thud. Before she could move, she scrambled down after him, pulling the floorboard back into place. And then there was silence. A thick, ringing silence, broken only by the distant roar of the storm and the man's shallow, ragged breathing. She had done it. He was hidden. And she was trapped in the dark with him. As her eyes adjusted, she saw the extent of his injuries. A deep gash on his side was still sluggishly weeping blood, and his face was a pale, stark mask of pain. Deep down, she knew the truth. Hiding him was only the first step. If he was going to live, he needed more than just a hiding place.
Blackness. Pain. The cold. For a long time, that was all there was. He was drifting in an endless, agonizing sea. But then, something else broke through. A scent. It wasn't the coppery smell of his own blood or the earthy scent of the storm. This was something else entirely. Something impossible. It smelled of wild herbs and clean rain, and a sweetness so pure and profound it was like the first breath of spring after a long, cruel winter. It was an anchor in the storm of his pain. His wolf, the ancient, kingly spirit within him, stirred from its battered slumber. It was a weak, flickering thing now, but it recognized that scent. It knew that scent on a level deeper than thought, deeper than memory. It was a call that had been woven into his soul since the day he was born. Mate. The word was not a thought. It was a feeling, a certainty, a fire that bloomed in the frozen landscape of his consciousness. As if pulled by a string, he fought his way up from the depths, clawing his way back toward the light. He had to see her. He had to know who she was. With a monumental effort, he forced his eyelids open. The world was a blurry mess, but he could make out a shape hovering over him, a silhouette in the gloom. A woman. She was wiping his face with a damp cloth, her touch so gentle it was almost painful. He tried to focus. He saw a slender frame, a fall of dark, tangled hair, and then, for a single earth-shattering heartbeat, his vision cleared. He saw her eyes. They were wide and filled with a terrifying, beautiful compassion. The eyes of an Omega, the eyes of the woman who smelled like his forever. In the span of a breath, his entire world tilted. His quest for vengeance, his rage, his throne. It all faded into the background. There was only her. Before he could speak, before he could do anything but burn her face into his memory, the blackness surged back, dragging him under once more. But this time it was different. This time he wasn't just fighting for his kingdom. He was fighting to get back to her.
The next day was a special kind of hell. Every creak of the floorboards above was the sound of a guard's boot. Every raised voice was an alarm. She had to go about her chores, her face a mask of dull obedience, while her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her secret was a living thing, breathing in the darkness just beneath her feet. But the fear of being caught was nothing compared to the fear of him dying. His breathing had grown more shallow overnight, and a fever was beginning to burn through him. His skin was hot to the touch. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that if she didn't do something, he wouldn't last another day, which meant she had to break another rule, a much bigger one. She had to steal from the pack's stores. The punishment for that was a public flogging, at best. That night, she waited until the barracks were filled with the soft sounds of sleep. Then, with her heart in her throat, she slipped out. The citadel was a different beast at night. Shadows danced like ghosts, and the air was cold and still. She crept along the walls, a phantom in the dark, her bare feet making no sound on the cold stone. The storehouse was near the kitchens, and her destination was the small apothecary section where the pack healer kept her herbs. She found what she was looking for: feverfew, and willow bark for the pain, and some dried moss for bandages. Her hands trembled as she stuffed them into a small pouch. This was it. She was a traitor, a thief. She was everything they always said Omegas were. As she turned to leave, she heard voices. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She ducked behind a stack of crates, making herself as small as possible. 2 of Vorlog's personal guards rounded the corner, their armor glinting in the moonlight. Heard they found another royalist sympathizer down by the river, one of them grumbled. Lord Vorlag will make an example of him, the other replied, his voice flat and cruel. He wants every wolf to know what happens when you dream of the old king. Tessa held her breath. The old king. They had to be talking about the man in her cellar. The stakes, she realized with a fresh wave of terror, were so much higher than she had imagined. When the guards finally passed, she didn't move for a long time. Her new reality was settling in, heavy and suffocating. She wasn't just hiding a wounded stranger. She was hiding an enemy of the pack, an enemy of the man who ruled them all with an iron fist. By the time she made it back to the cellar, she was shaking uncontrollably. She managed to crush the herbs and make a poultice, her hands working on autopilot. She cleaned his wounds as best she could, and gently forced a bitter tea of willow bark between his lips. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open, but this time, they stayed open. They were a startling, intense gold, and they were fixed on her. And for the first time, she felt a different kind of fear. Not of the guards, but of him. He was awake, and the raw, untamed power that rolled off him, even in his weakened state, was unlike anything she had ever felt in her life. It was a physical pressure, a silent command that vibrated in the very air around them, and every instinct in her Omega body screamed at her to bow.
Days bled into a strange, timeless rhythm in the dark. His body was knitting itself back together, the fire of his healing factor finally taking hold. But the weakness, the helplessness, it was a poison of its own. He, Aldrich, the Alpha King who could command legions with a single word, was now completely dependent on the quiet courage of a lone Omega girl. He watched her. He learned the soft sound of her footsteps on the floorboards above. He learned the way she moved, a study in self-effacement, making herself small to avoid the brutish shoves and careless cruelties of the pack above. And he saw the moments she thought he was asleep, when she would press a hand to her own stomach, her face tight with a hunger she refused to acknowledge. She was starving herself for him. To make things worse, one morning, the world above went quiet. Too quiet. Then came the heavy sound of a wooden bar being dropped into place. Shouts echoed from outside. They were locked in. Quarantined. "What is it?" he asked, his voice stronger now. Tessa's face was pale when she returned to the cellar. "Spotted fever," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Someone in the next barrack took ill. No one in or out until the healer gives the all-clear." His frustration boiled over. He was a prisoner twice over, trapped by his wounds in a cellar, and trapped in that cellar by a sickness. He clenched his fist. "How long?" "A few days, maybe a week." She wouldn't meet his eyes. We don't have much left." He knew what that meant. The small pouch of dried meat and the half-full water skin were all they had. And it wasn't enough. Not for a healing alpha and a girl who was already too thin. That night she portioned out a small piece of meat for him and a sip of water. For herself, she took nothing. "You need to eat," he said, his voice a low command. "I'm not hungry," she lied. He could smell the lie on her. He could hear the faint, desperate growl of her empty stomach. Truth be told, her quiet sacrifice was a blade to his heart. His most trusted warriors, men who had sworn blood oaths to him, had betrayed him for power. And this girl, this stranger who owed him nothing, was offering him her own survival without a second thought. "Tessa," he said, his voice softer this time. He held out his portion. "We share, or I don't eat at all." Her eyes widened, shocked that he would even suggest it. In their world, the alpha ate first. Always. It was the law of the pack, as old as the mountains. Without another word, she slowly took the offered food, her fingers brushing against his. A jolt, hot and electric, shot up his arm. The bond. It pulsed between them. A silent, powerful thing. She felt it too. He saw it in the sudden darkness of her pupils. Between them, something cracked. A wall she didn't even know she'd built. She tore the small piece of meat in two, giving the larger half back to him. As they ate in silence, the world narrowed to the small, dark space and the shared, desperate hope of survival. He realized with a startling clarity that her quiet strength was more profound than any alpha's roar he had ever heard.
The quarantine ended on the 5th day, just as their last drops of water were gone. The heavy bar was lifted with a groan, and the sounds of the pack rushed back in. The relief was so intense it made her dizzy. They had survived. But then, a different sound sent a shard of ice through her veins. Heavy, armored footsteps, too many of them, and an aura of power so immense, so suffocating, it stole the very air from her lungs. Vorlag. "Everyone out!" a guard bellowed. "Lord Vorlag requires your presence." Her blood ran cold. She scrambled up from the cellar, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Stay calm. Be invisible. She joined the other Omegas as they were herded out into the muddy clearing, their heads bowed, their bodies trembling. Lord Vorlag stood there, flanked by his personal guard. He was a mountain of a man, his black armor gleaming, his face a mask of cold, cruel authority. He never came to the mud quarters. Never. His presence here was a violation, a promise of pain. "There is a traitor in this pack," Vorlag's voice boomed, a sound like grinding stone. "A sympathizer of the old regime. We have reason to believe they are hiding among the lowest of the low." His cold, dead eyes swept over them. Tessa focused on a patch of mud at her feet, praying, begging any god that might be listening to make her disappear. She could feel him. The man in the cellar. She could feel his presence beneath her feet, a silent, coiled serpent of rage and power. She prayed he would stay hidden, that he wouldn't let his hatred for the man above betray them both. With every heartbeat, the tension grew. Vorlag paced before them, his boots squelching in the mud. He was a wolf sniffing out a rabbit. And then, he stopped. He stopped right in front of her. Her world tilted. Time stood still. She could feel his shadow fall over her, cold and absolute. She could smell the scent of iron and cold fury clinging to him. She dared not look up. "You," he said. The word was quiet, but it hit her with the force of a physical blow. "I don't recognize you. What is your name?" Her voice trembled. "Tessa, my lord." Under the weight of his stare, she felt a sudden, terrifying pressure from below. Aldrich. He was reacting to Vorlag's proximity to her. The royal alpha aura she'd felt before was flaring, pushing up from the earth, a silent roar of possession and challenge. If Vorlag felt it, they were both dead. Without thinking, she pressed the heel of her foot down hard on the loose floorboard, a desperate, silent signal. "Stop. Please, stop." Vorlag's eyes narrowed. For a heart-stopping moment, he just stared at her, his gaze intense and searching, as if he was trying to peel back her skin and see the secrets hiding in her soul. A beat later, he gave a dismissive sneer. Pathetic. And then, he moved on. The moment passed. The collective breath of the Omegas was released in a shaky sigh. But as he walked away, Tessa knew with a chilling certainty that something had changed. He had seen her. For the first time in her life, she was no longer invisible, and she had a terrible feeling that was the most dangerous thing that could have possibly happened.
The fear still clinging to her was a scent in the small cellar, sharp and bitter like burnt herbs. Forlag's presence had been a physical violation, a poison seeping through the floorboards, and Aldrich had felt every second of it. He had felt the crushing weight of his enemy's gaze on his mate, and it had taken every shred of his kingly control not to roar, not to smash through the floor and tear the usurper's throat out right there. Only the thought of her, of what would happen to her, had kept him coiled in the darkness. Because of that, he knew things had to change. Hiding wasn't enough, not anymore. Vorlag had seen her. She was no longer invisible, which meant she was no longer safe. "He will remember you," Aldrich said, his voice a low growl in the quiet that followed. Tessa was huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped around her knees. She just nodded, her eyes wide and haunted. The terror was still fresh. "That fear you feel," he went on, his voice softening slightly, "can be a weapon, or it can be a cage. The choice is yours." He pushed himself up, his muscles protesting but obeying. He was still weak, but the fire was returning. "You survived today because you are small and quiet. You blend in. But you also survived because you were clever. That signal you gave me, pressing on the floorboard, that was instinct. A warrior's instinct." She looked up, her expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. "I'm not a warrior." "No," he agreed. "You're something far more useful. You're a ghost, and I'm going to teach you how to haunt this place." So their lessons began. It wasn't about fighting. He had nothing to teach her there. Instead, it was about awareness, about seeing the world as a predator does. At the same time, he taught her how to listen to the citadel. The guards changed shifts every 6 hours, he'd whisper, his voice a low rumble against her ear as they knelt by a crack in the floorboards. "But the afternoon shift is lazy. They linger by the kitchens for scraps. That's your window." He taught her how to read the patterns of the patrols, how to use the deepest shadows, how to tell by the sound of a boot on stone whether a guard was alert or bored. To make things worse, she was a natural. Her lifetime of forced invisibility had honed her senses to a razor's edge. She absorbed everything, her quiet determination a constant surprise. More importantly, he saw a change in her. With every small piece of knowledge, the fear in her eyes was slowly, painstakingly, being replaced by a fragile, flickering confidence. In fact, he found himself looking forward to their hushed lessons, to the way her brow would furrow in concentration, to the small, triumphant smile she'd give when she understood. He was the king and she was the Omega. But here, in the dark, they were just Aldrich and Tessa. One evening a real test came. A guard patrol, earlier than scheduled, swept through the barracks. Tessa was above, getting water. Aldrich's heart hammered against his ribs. He was utterly helpless below. He could only listen. He heard her soft footsteps halt. He heard the heavy crunch of the guard's boots approaching. The silence stretched, thin and tight. He pictured her, making herself small, melting into the shadows just as he'd taught her. Moments later, the heavy footsteps moved on, and then he heard her again, her breathing a little shaky, but safe. She had done it. She had faced a direct threat and used what he'd taught her to survive. When she slipped back into the cellar, her eyes were shining with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, and he felt a fierce, unfamiliar surge of pride. It was a feeling so potent it startled him, and in that moment, he knew. He couldn't keep her in the dark any longer. She had earned the truth. All of it.
You did well. His voice, coming from the shadows, made her jump. The praise was a warm current in the cold cellar, chasing away the last of her fear from the close call with the guards. A small, shaky smile touched her lips. You're a good teacher. You're a fast learner, he corrected, his golden eyes intense. He shifted, his expression growing serious, and the little bubble of warmth in her chest popped. But now you need to know why you're learning this. You need to know what you're really a part of. Her heart skipped. She sat down on the packed earth opposite him, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. The men who wounded me, he began, his voice low and heavy with a pain that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. They weren't rogues, they were my own men, my most trusted guards. He told her everything. He spoke of a pack that was once proud, built on honor. He spoke of a second in command, a wolf he had loved like a brother, named Vorlag. He spoke of whispers of ambition, of a lust for power that he had foolishly ignored. And then he told her of the ambush. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but his hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists. He described the betrayal during a border patrol, the shock, the blades, the casual cruelty on Vorlag's face as he gave the order to kill. As the silence roared, she could see it all. The glint of steel, the cold forest, the death of a king. They left me for dead, he finished, his gaze locked on hers. Vorlag announced to the pack that I was killed by rogues. He used their grief and their fear to seize power. He made himself alpha. Tessa's thoughts spun. The world she knew, the brutal, oppressive world ruled by Lord Vorlag, was built on a lie. A bloody, murderous lie. The man in front of her wasn't just a political enemy. He was a ghost, a walking, breathing impossibility. Her head was swimming. Her entire life she had been a slave, and she had just spent weeks hiding, healing, and sharing her food with the one person Vorlag wanted erased from history more than anyone else. The air thickened, her breath catching in her throat. Without thinking, she knew what he was going to say next. She felt it, etched in fire. He took a slow breath, the sound loud in the small space. My name is Aldrich, he said, his voice resonating with an ancient power that made the very dust motes dance. And I was the alpha king of this pack. Her world tilted. The cellar, the pack, her entire life. It all just shattered. The wounded man she had saved out of simple, foolish compassion was a king, a legend, and she, the most invisible Omega in the Black Moon Pack, was now the keeper of the greatest, most dangerous secret in the world. As if the world narrowed, there was only the burning intensity of his golden eyes and the impossible weight of his words. The space between them burned with the truth. After a moment that stretched for an eternity, he asked the question that would seal her fate one way or another. Now that you know, he said, his voice soft but impossibly heavy. Will you still help me? Help him? The question was absurd. It was like asking a mouse if it would help a lion fight a dragon. What could she possibly do? Her mind was a whirlwind of sheer, unadulterated terror. Helping a stranger was a crime. Helping a deposed king. That was treason. That was an act of war. The punishment for that didn't even have a name. She couldn't speak. She could only stare at him, her heart a frantic, trapped thing. He was Aldrich, the true Alpha King. The stories the old ones sometimes whispered of a time before Vorlag, a time of honor and pride, they were about him. And he was asking her for help. Her, the girl who ate mud-soaked bread. Before either could speak again, a commotion erupted from the world above. It wasn't the usual noise of the barracks. This was different. There were shouts, an angry roar, and then a woman's scream, sharp and terrified. As if pulled by a string, Tessa scrambled to the crack in the floorboards. Aldrich was right beside her, his body tense, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Outside, in the gray afternoon light, Vorlag's enforcers were dragging an old Omega into the center of the clearing. It was Alara, the woman who had warned her not to get involved. "This is what happens to grumblers," one of the guards bellowed, shoving Alara to her knees. "This is what happens to those who question the strength of our alpha." Vorlag wasn't there, but his cruelty was. Alara's crime, apparently, had been to mutter that the rations were smaller than ever. A guard had overheard her, and now she was being made into an example. Tessa watched in horror as the guard raised a thick leather strap. Alara didn't scream again. She just knelt there, her back bowed, waiting for the inevitable. Something inside Tessa snapped. It wasn't a thought. It was a feeling. A white-hot surge of pure, undiluted rage. This was her world. This was the world Vorlag had made. A world where an old woman could be beaten for being hungry. A world where survival meant crushing every shred of dignity and compassion out of yourself. A world where being invisible was the only way to live. And she was sick of it. She was so sick of being afraid. The first lash cracked through the air. Alara's body shuddered, and Tessa's choice was made. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But now, it was smaller than the anger. It was smaller than the burning, righteous fury that consumed her. She had been hiding from a monster. But the real monster wasn't the king in her cellar. It was the one on the throne. She turned away from the crack, her back to the horror outside. She faced Aldrich in the gloom, and he saw the change in her. He saw the terror in her eyes being burned away by a new, chilling resolve. The little Omega mouse was gone. When her name left his lips, it was a question. "Tessa?" Her voice, when she spoke, didn't tremble. It was as hard and as cold as the stone walls of the citadel. "Tell me what you need me to do." "Help him?" The question was absurd. It was like asking a mouse if it would help a lion fight a dragon. What could she possibly do? Her mind was a whirlwind of sheer, unadulterated terror. Helping a stranger was a crime. Helping a deposed king, that was treason. That was an act of war. The punishment for that didn't even have a name. She couldn't speak. She could only stare at him, her heart a frantic, trapped thing. He was Aldrich, the true Alpha King. The stories the old ones sometimes whispered of a time before Vorlag, a time of honor and pride, they were about him. And he was asking her for help. Her, the girl who ate mud-soaked bread. Before either could speak again, a commotion erupted from the world above. It wasn't the usual noise of the barracks. This was different. There were shouts, an angry roar, and then a woman's scream, sharp and terrified. As if pulled by a string, Tessa scrambled to the crack in the floorboards. Aldrich was right beside her, his body tense, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Outside, in the gray afternoon light, Vorlag's enforcers were dragging an old Omega into the center of the clearing. It was Alara, the woman who had warned her not to get involved. "This is what happens to grumblers," one of the guards bellowed, shoving Alara to her knees. "This is what happens to those who question the strength of our alpha." Vorlag wasn't there, but his cruelty was. Alara's crime, apparently, had been to mutter that the rations were smaller than ever. A guard had overheard her, and now she was being made into an example. Tessa watched in horror as the guard raised a thick leather strap. Alara didn't scream again. She just knelt there, her back bowed, waiting for the inevitable. Something inside Tessa snapped. It wasn't a thought. It was a feeling. A white-hot surge of pure, undiluted rage. This was her world. This was the world Vorlag had made. A world where an old woman could be beaten for being hungry. A world where survival meant crushing every shred of dignity and compassion out of yourself. A world where being invisible was the only way to live. And she was sick of it. She was so sick of being afraid. The first lash cracked through the air. Alara's body shuddered. And Tessa's choice was made. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But now it was smaller than the anger. It was smaller than the burning, righteous fury that consumed her. She had been hiding from a monster. But the real monster wasn't the king in her cellar. It was the one on the throne. She turned away from the crack, her back to the horror outside. She faced Aldrich in the gloom, and he saw the change in her. He saw the terror in her eyes being burned away by a new, chilling resolve. The little Omega mouse was gone. When her name left his lips, it was a question. Tessa? Her voice, when she spoke, didn't tremble. It was as hard and as cold as the stone walls of the citadel. Tell me what you need me to do.
The information was a spark in the darkness. Silver dust. An aqueduct. It was more than he could have hoped for. Forlag wasn't just a tyrant. He was a paranoid one. He was preparing for a war against his own people, and in his paranoia, he had created a weakness. A back door into his fortress. But information was useless unless acted upon. I need to see this passage, he said, his mind already racing, and I need to send a message. Tessa's face was pale, the fear from her close call still clinging to her. A message? To who? To anyone who still remembers what this pack used to be, he said, his voice grim. There are those loyal to my father's memory. Warriors who bent the knee to Vorlag out of fear, not fealty. They need a sign, a symbol that the true king has returned. That night, they moved. It was a terrible risk, but staying hidden was no longer an option. He was still not at full strength, but his wolf was a restless fire beneath his skin, demanding action. He left the cellar for the first time in weeks. The cool night air a balm on his senses. Tessa was his guide, a silent shadow leading him along the forgotten paths at the edge of the settlement. She led him to the base of the citadel's west wall, to a section overgrown with thick, thorny vines. And there, hidden behind the curtain of green, was a crumbling stone archway sealed with an iron grate. The aqueduct. It was real. Stand watch, he commanded softly. While her pulse raced, he drew a small, sharp blade he'd kept hidden in his boot. On the ancient stone lintel above the grate, he began to carve. The scrape of steel on stone was loud in the silence. He worked quickly, his hands sure and steady. He carved the symbol of his house, the sigil of his royal line. A snarling wolf's head silhouetted against a full moon. It was a declaration, a challenge, an act of war. He had just finished when Tessa gave a sharp, almost inaudible hiss. He melted back into the shadows beside her just as a patrol rounded the wall. His heart pounded. They were exposed, utterly exposed. But the guards, just as she'd said, were lazy. They walked right past the overgrown archway without a second glance. The moment they were gone, he grabbed her hand. Come. They fled back to the safety of the barracks, their hearts pounding in unison. They had done it. They had struck their first blow. A small one, but a blow nonetheless. Back in the cellar, the air crackled with their shared adrenaline. But their victory was short-lived. The next day, the entire settlement erupted in chaos. A furious roar echoed from the citadel, a sound of pure, volcanic rage that could only have come from one wolf. Forlag. Someone had found the carving. The news spread like wildfire. A sign of the old king had appeared on the citadel walls. The ghost had a name, and the usurper was furious. The hook had landed. But as the sounds of armored boots stomped through the mud quarters, a cold dread settled in Aldrich's stomach. He had poked the beast, and now the beast was going to bite back.
The retaliation was swift and brutal. Vorlag couldn't find the ghost who carved the sigil, so he decided to hunt the whispers instead. Enforcers, their faces grim and their fists ready, stormed the mud quarters. They were looking for a scapegoat, a lesson, and they found one. They dragged a woman from one of the neighboring barracks. Her name was Lyra, a frail, elderly Omega with kind eyes and a gentle soul. Tessa knew her. Once, years ago, Lyra had seen Tessa being punished for dropping a laundry basket and had secretly slipped her a sweet, ripe apple later that day. It was a small act of kindness Tessa had never forgotten. Now, Lyra was on her knees in the mud, accused of spreading seditious rumors about the old king. She had been overheard telling a story to one of the young ones, a story about a better time. "Who told you to say these things?" the lead enforcer snarled. his face inches from Lyra's. Lyra, her body trembling, just shook her head. "It is just a story." "Wrong answer," the guard growled. Tessa watched from the crack in the floorboards, her knuckles white, a silent scream trapped in her throat. Aldrich stood behind her, his entire body rigid with a murderous rage he was struggling to contain. She wanted to run out there, to scream, to do something. But Aldrich's hand on her shoulder, a firm, grounding pressure, held her in place. He knew it was suicide. The first blow landed and a collective gasp went through the watching Omegas. Lyra didn't cry out. The enforcer hit her again. He was going to kill her, right there, in front of everyone. And in that moment, Tessa's grief and rage and terror coalesced into a single chilling thought. This is my fault. Her spying, the carving. Their small act of rebellion had led to this. The weight of it was crushing. This was the cost of fighting back. The cost was Lyra's life. But then, something incredible happened. Lyra, her face bruised and bleeding, lifted her head. Her gaze swept over the terrified faces of the other Omegas, and for a split second, her eyes found the crack in the floorboards where Tessa was hiding. It was as if she could see straight through the wood, straight into Tessa's soul. Her eyes weren't filled with accusation. There was no blame. There was only pain, and a fierce burning plea. A silent message that passed between them in a single shattering heartbeat. Don't let this be for nothing. Finish it. The enforcer dragged Lyra to her feet and hauled her away toward the Citadel dungeons. She was broken, but she was not beaten. And her final, silent command was a brand on Tessa's heart. There was no going back. Not now. Not ever. The fight was no longer just for a throne or for a better world. Now, it was for Lyra. In the quiet that followed Lyra's abduction, the cellar became a cage. The silence was a living thing, thick with their shared grief and fury. Every shadow seemed to mock them. They had poked the beast, and the beast had taken a piece of their soul in return. Aldrich paced the small space, a caged wolf in truth, his power a low, dangerous hum that made her teeth ache. He was a king with no kingdom, a warrior with no army. And she was just a girl who had gotten an old woman tortured. The guilt was a physical weight pressing down on her, stealing her breath. She didn't know how much time had passed. Hours, maybe a day, when the world above them exploded. It wasn't a shout. It was a crash. A sound of splintering wood and furious guttural roars. Without warning, the floorboards above her splintered. A massive armored boot smashed through, then another. Sunlight, gray and hostile, sliced into their darkness. Dust and splinters rained down on them. They'd been found. Her mind went completely, blessedly blank. There was no thought, only a pure animal terror that seized her limbs. Aldrich moved. He was a blur of motion, grabbing her and shoving her toward the back of the cellar, shielding her with his own body. "They're coming through the main barracks," he roared over the din. Heavy bodies dropped into the cellar, Vorlog's enforcers, their faces twisted into snarling masks. They were not there to take prisoners. Their swords were drawn, gleaming with hungry, malevolent light. The space between them burned with imminent death. Aldrich met them. He moved with a speed and brutality that was terrifying to behold. He was no longer the wounded man she had nursed. He was the Alpha King, a whirlwind of controlled, lethal fury. But there were too many of them. 3, 4. In the cramped space, it was a chaotic, desperate brawl. The clang of a sword parried by his vambrace echoed like a death knell. But then, her eyes locked on something else. During the raid, the back wall of the cellar, the part that pressed against the earth of the hillside, had cracked under the force of the attack. A network of thick roots was visible. A way out. "Aldrich!" she screamed, her voice raw. He saw it. He disengaged with a powerful shove that sent one guard stumbling back, then spun, grabbing her arm. "Go! Now!" He clawed at the dirt and roots, tearing them away, his powerful hands making short work of the wall. It wasn't a tunnel. It was a burrow. A hole just big enough to squeeze through. He pushed her toward it. Go! She scrambled through, dirt and roots tearing at her clothes and skin. She emerged on the wooded hillside behind the barracks, gasping in the cold, clean air. She turned, expecting him to be right behind her. Instead, she saw the glint of a sword blade as it was thrust into the hole she'd just escaped. A pained, furious roar erupted from the cellar, a sound of pure agony. Her heart stopped. Aldrich. The sounds of the fight intensified, then abruptly went silent. A cold, heavy silence that was so much worse than the noise. Her thoughts spun. He was dead. She had led him here, and he was dead. To make things worse, she was alone, exposed, and hunted. She had to run, but her feet felt like lead, rooted to the spot by a grief so profound it felt like the end of the world.
Pain. White-hot and blinding. The sword had gone deep into his thigh, a crippling blow. He had roared as much in fury as in agony, and used the last of his strength to pull the guard off balance, snapping his arm before dispatching him. But the damage was done. He was bleeding. Badly. And the other two were closing in. He fought. He fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, but his leg was failing him. His movements were clumsy, slow. He managed to kill another, but the last guard, a huge scarred beta, got inside his defenses, the hilt of his sword smashing into Aldrich's temple. The world exploded in a shower of black stars. He fell, his head hitting the hard-packed earth. The fight was over. He had failed. He lay there, helpless, as the beta stood over him, raising his sword for the killing blow. This was it. This was the end. He had lost his kingdom, and now he had lost his mate, sending her out alone into a world that would tear her apart. The last thought in his mind was her face. Tessa. But then, a new sound. A twig snapping in the woods outside. The beta froze, his head cocked. Without another word, he turned and scrambled out of the cellar the way they had come in. He was leaving. Why was he leaving? Moments later, a new figure dropped into the cellar. Not an enforcer. An old wolf, his face a road map of scars. But his eyes were clear and sharp, and loyal. He wore the leathers of a hunter, not a soldier. My king, the old wolf breathed, dropping to one knee. I saw the mark. I have been searching. Hope. It was a feeling so foreign, so painful, he almost couldn't bear it. An ally. What is your name? Aldrich grunted, trying to push himself up. Gideon, my lord. I served under your father. Gideon helped him to his feet, his grip strong and steady. They are coming. The whole pack is being roused. We have to move now. Gideon led him out through the burrow, supporting most of his weight. The forest was cold, and a light, wet snow had begun to fall, clinging to the bare branches of the trees. It would cover their tracks, a small mercy. Vorlag found Lyra. Gideon explained in a low, grim voice as they moved. She did not break. But he has trackers who can scent fear. They followed the trail of her terror back to the girls' barracks. He handed Aldrich a water skin and a strip of dried meat. We have little time. They found a small, hidden cave carved out of the rock face, barely big enough for two. It was cold, but it was cover. Aldrich collapsed inside, his leg on fire. Gideon tended to the wound, his movements practiced and efficient. You have an ally in the citadel, Gideon said, his voice a low whisper. A kitchen servant. She's the one who got word to me about the carving. She said an Omega girl with haunted eyes has been asking questions. Tessa. She had been building a network without even knowing it. She had been inspiring hope. The thought was a warmth in his frozen heart. But then, as if fate demanded it, their hope was shattered. A howl split the air. Close. Too close. Trackers. Gideon was on his feet in an instant, a blade in his hand. They followed us. They followed me, Aldrich corrected, his voice laced with a bitter self-loathing. He was a beacon for death. He brought ruin to all who helped him. Before either could speak, they were on them. 3 of Vorlag's elite hunters, their forms shifting into the monstrous shapes of their werewolves as they charged. Gideon met the first one with a roar, his blade sinking deep. But he was old. And there were 3. Aldrich tried to fight, but his leg buckled beneath him. He was useless. He could only watch as a second wolf tore out Gideon's throat. The old wolf fell with a soft, wet sigh, his loyal eyes fixed on his king. His last breath was a silent apology for his failure. The remaining 2 wolves turned on Aldrich. It was over. But then, one of them caught a new scent on the wind, a scent Aldrich knew better than his own. Tessa. She must have circled back. She was nearby. One of the wolves let out a triumphant howl and bounded off in her direction. Something inside Aldrich broke. Not just his hope. His soul. No. The word was a silent scream in his mind. Not her. Anyone but her. He surged to his feet, ignoring the fire in his leg, the black spots dancing in his vision. He had to save her. It was the only thought in his head. The last wolf lunged at him, but Aldrich was moving on pure, primal instinct. He sidestepped, his blade coming up in a brutal, desperate arc that opened the beast's side. It fell, howling, and he was already running, stumbling, limping through the snow, following the sound of the other wolf crashing through the underbrush. He burst into a clearing. A frozen waterfall stood like a monument of ice against the cliff face. And there, backed against the ice, was Tessa. Her face was a mask of sheer terror. The massive werewolf was stalking toward her, its lips curled back in a hungry snarl. He was too far away. He would never make it in time. Deep down, he knew the truth. He couldn't save them both. But maybe he could save one of them. Tessa, he roared, pouring every ounce of his royal alpha aura into the sound. It was a command that shook the very trees. Run! He didn't wait to see if she obeyed. He spun around and crashed back into the forest in the opposite direction, making as much noise as he possibly could. A diversion, a sacrifice. Draw them to him, let her go. It was the only move he had left. He ran, his vision blurring, his legs screaming. But he didn't hear them following him. Why weren't they following him? He risked a glance back, and his world ended. The wolf wasn't chasing him. It was standing over a fallen, still Tessa. And another figure was emerging from the trees. A figure in black armor, his face a mask of triumphant cruelty. Vorlag. He had been there all along. He had used his own hunter as bait, as a lure, and Aldrich, in his desperate attempt to save her, had led Vorlag right to her. He had sealed her fate. He watched, frozen, helpless from across the clearing, as Vorlag grabbed Tessa by the arm and hauled her to her feet. She was a doll in his grasp, small and broken. Her terrified eyes found his across the snow-dusted space, and in them, he saw it all. Betrayal. Despair. The end. Vorlag just smiled, a cold, predatory smile. He leaned down and whispered something in her ear, then began to drag her away into the forest. Aldrich was left alone in the clearing. The silence of the snow-covered woods was absolute. He had failed. He had lost his kingdom. He had lost his last ally. And now he had lost his mate. He had not just failed to protect her. He had delivered her to the monster himself. He fell to his knees in the snow, the cold seeping into his bones, and for the first time since he was a child, a harsh, broken sob tore its way from his chest. All was lost.
Cold. That was the first thing she knew. A deep, seeping cold that came from the stone floor up through her bones and settled in her soul. She was in the Citadel dungeons, a place of nightmares, and she was alone. Vorlag had left her in the darkness, his final words a poison whispered in her ear. He ran, the usurper had sneered, his breath hot and foul. The moment you were no longer useful, your precious king left you to die. That is the way of alphas. That is the way of the world. The words echoed in the crushing silence, trying to find purchase, trying to break her. And for a moment, they almost did. She thought of Aldrich, crashing through the forest, away from her, away from danger, leaving her behind. But then, something else rose through the cold and the fear. Another memory. The memory of Aldrich in the cellar, weak and broken, looking at her with a desperate, burning hope. The memory of him sharing his last piece of food. The memory of him teaching her not how to fight, but how to see. Her wolf, the small, quiet thing she'd suppressed her entire life, stirred. It was a flicker of warmth in the vast, consuming cold. "Liar," it whispered. So when Vorlag returned, his massive frame filling the doorway of her cell, she was ready. "Have you had time to reconsider?" he asked, his voice dripping with indulgent condescension. "Tell me where he is. Tell me who his allies are, and I will grant you a quick death." She just looked at him. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She didn't even tremble. She just met his cold, dead eyes with the full, silent weight of her defiance. She had nothing left to lose, and in that, she found a strange and terrible freedom. He didn't like that. He wanted her to scream. He wanted her to beg. Her silence was a weapon he didn't understand. He backhanded her, the blow snapping her head to the side, her lips splitting against her teeth. The taste of her own blood, hot and coppery, filled her mouth. Still, she said nothing. He growled, a low, frustrated sound, and stormed away, leaving her in the dark once more. But he had made a mistake. He hadn't realized they were not alone. A young servant girl, tasked with bringing the prisoners their daily slop, had been standing in the shadows of the corridor. She had seen it all. She had seen the Alpha Lord strike the Omega Girl, and she had seen the Omega Girl refuse to break. The servant's eyes met Tessa's through the bars. They were filled with fear, yes. But beneath the fear was something else. A flicker of awe. A spark of rebellion. As the silence stretched, Tessa realized that her defiance was no longer just her own. It was a seed, and it had just been planted in the most fertile ground imaginable, the hearts of the forgotten.
The snow was a shroud, covering the world in a blanket of silent white despair. He knelt where Vorlag had left him, the cold a welcome numbness against the raging agony in his soul. He had lost. It was over. Gideon was dead. Tessa was captured. His cause was nothing but ash. What's worse, he was a curse. Everyone who came near him, everyone who showed him an ounce of loyalty or kindness, paid the ultimate price. His father, Gideon, Tessa. He brought nothing but death. A sound tore its way from his chest. It wasn't the roar of a king, it wasn't the snarl of a warrior. It was a howl. A long, broken, soul-shattering howl of pure, absolute grief. It ripped through the silent forest, a sound of utter loss, echoing off the frozen waterfall and into the gray, unforgiving sky. He poured all of his pain, all of his failure, all of his love for the woman he had doomed, into that one, final sound. He expected only silence in return. Instead, an answer came. It was faint at first, a single hesitant howl from the north ridge, then another, from the east. They weren't the strong, challenging calls of pack warriors. These were different. They were the thin, reedy calls of the old, the uncertain cries of the outcast, the desperate howls of the forgotten. Slowly, figures began to emerge from the trees. An old wolf, his fur more gray than black, his limp pronounced. A young she-wolf, her frame gaunt with two small pups hiding behind her legs. A hunter with a scarred face and a mangled arm that had seen him cast out from the patrols. They were the bottom of the pack. The ones Vorlag deemed too weak, too useless to even notice. They stopped a respectful distance away, their eyes filled not with awe of a king, but with a shared understanding of pain. "We heard," the old wolf said, his voice a gravelly rasp. We did not hear an alpha's challenge. We heard a brother's grief. In that moment, something inside Aldrich shifted. He had been trying to reclaim his throne with strength and fury. He had been trying to fight Vorlag's way. But these wolves, they hadn't answered a call to war. They had answered a cry of the heart. He had lost his army, but he had found his people. As the truth unraveled, he understood. True strength wasn't the power to command the strong. It was the courage to stand with the broken. His despair was replaced by a new, fierce resolve. His goal was no longer vengeance, it was liberation. Not just for himself, but for all of them. They made camp in a hidden den, the small fire a beacon of defiance against the encroaching night. His new army was a pathetic sight, but they were also his greatest weapon. Because of that, Vorlag had forgotten they existed. We cannot face his enforcers in a direct fight, the old wolf, whose name was Kale, stated the obvious. We won't, Aldrich said, his eyes on the flickering flames. We won't fight his way, we'll fight ours. He looked at them, at the outcasts, the invisible ones. You know this citadel better than any of his guards. You know the servants' paths, the forgotten tunnels, the weak points. He turned to the she-wolf. You know the kitchens. To the lame hunter. You know the patrol schedules, the blind spots. His gaze settled back on Kale. And you know the hearts of the old families who are tired of living in fear. A plan began to form, not a glorious charge through the front gates, but a quiet, insidious infiltration, a rebellion of whispers and shadows. They would use Vorlag's arrogance against him. They would use their invisibility as a cloak. They would enter the citadel through the aqueduct, the path Tessa had found for them, and they would not seize the throne. They would expose the tyrant sitting on it.
Hope came in the form of a rusted key. The young servant girl, the one who had witnessed Vorlag's cruelty, returned with the next meal. Her hands trembled as she slid the thin bowl of watery stew through the bars. But as she did, her fingers brushed against Tessa's and a small cold piece of metal was pressed into her palm. Her eyes met the servant's. Lyra was my mother's sister, the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. She was kind to me. Before Tessa could react, the girl was gone. Tessa stared at the key in her hand. It was old, bent. It wouldn't open the massive, solid lock on her cell door. It was useless. Her brief spark of hope sputtered and died. But later that night, as she ran her fingers over the cold stone of her cell, she felt it. A small square outline near the floor. A maintenance grate, long since sealed over with rust and grime. With trembling fingers, she inserted the key into a tiny, almost invisible keyhole. It resisted. She pushed. It scraped. It groaned. And then, with a soft, metallic click, it turned. She worked the grate loose. The passage beyond was pitch black and barely wide enough for her to crawl through. It didn't lead to freedom. It led to the cell next door, and the one after that. A new plan bloomed in her mind, wild and terrifying. She wasn't meant to escape. She was meant to be a spark. Her goal wasn't to get out. It was to let everyone else in.
The night of the full moon was cold and clear. The time had come. He led his small, forgotten pack to the hidden entrance of the aqueduct. The water was frigid, stealing their warmth, but not their resolve. They moved in silence, a procession of ghosts returning to reclaim their home. The journey through the dark, cramped tunnel was tense. Every drip of water, every scrape of a boot on stone, a potential death sentence. As they emerged into a subterranean storeroom beneath the citadel, Aldrich took a breath. This was it, the final push. At the same time, deep within the dungeons, Tessa was moving. She crawled through the grate, her heart a frantic drum. She whispered to the prisoners in the other cells, her voice a beacon in their despair. The Alpha King has returned, she told them. Tonight, we remind them that we are not slaves. The plan was in motion. Both fronts of their desperate, impossible war were advancing. Aldrich was racing toward the throne room to confront the monster. And Tessa, the quiet Omega girl, was about to unleash chaos from the very heart of his fortress. The point of no return had been passed. The final battle was about to begin. As he reached the base of the staircase leading to the throne room, he gave a silent command to his followers to create their diversions. Then, with a roar that was part rage, part grief, and all king, he kicked open the great hall doors. Vorlag was there, waiting, a cruel, knowing smile on his face. "I've been expecting you." The great hall doors of the throne room slammed against the stone walls, the sound an explosion in the tense silence. And there he was, Vorlag, not surprised, not alarmed. He was sitting on his throne, a cruel, self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. The air crackled, thick with the scent of ozone and old blood. Time stood still. "I've been expecting you," Vorlag said, his voice a low, mocking purr. "Did you enjoy your time in the dirt, King?" Rage. Pure, black, and absolute. It was a tide of fire that consumed every rational thought. This was the male who had betrayed him, who had stolen his life, who had laid hands on his mate. Before the words left his lips, Aldrich was moving. He lunged, a blur of fury. The fight was not a battle of skill. It was a clash of primal forces. Claws met steel, a roar, a grunt. They crashed against the stone dais, the force of their impact cracking the marble. Aldrich was stronger, his royal blood afire in his veins. But Vorlag was a brawler, a creature of pure, underhanded brutality. "She was so easy to break, you know," Vorlag snarled, landing a solid punch to Aldrich's ribs. "Cried for you at first, a little." The words were poison darts. Aldrich saw red. His vision narrowed to the sneering face of his enemy. He let his rage take over, his movements becoming wild, sloppy, and Vorlag, the cunning beast, took advantage. He sidestepped a clumsy lunge, his leg sweeping out, sending Aldrich crashing to the floor. Vorlag was on him in an instant, a dagger pressed to his throat. "This is how it ends," Vorlag hissed, his face inches from Aldrich's. Alone, forgotten, just like her. But then, a new sound. A commotion from the back of the hall. The doors were pushed open again, not with a crash, but with a quiet, deliberate force. And she was there. Tessa. Not broken. Not crying. She was flanked by the very prisoners Vorlag had left to rot, their faces a mixture of fear and a new, unfamiliar hope. She was a queen leading a ghost army. The pack's enforcers, drawn by the fight, had gathered, their faces a mixture of confusion and shock. They looked from the Alpha on the throne to the Alpha on the floor, and then to the Omega girl who stood before them all. Her world tilted. Aldrich stared, his breath catching in his throat. He had thought her lost, but she wasn't lost. She was magnificent.
She had felt the fight. The clash of two alpha powers had been a tremor through the very stones of the citadel. She had followed it, the freed prisoners a silent, shuffling tide behind her. As she entered the throne room, the scene before her was a nightmare made real. Aldrich on the floor, Vorlag standing over him, a blade at his throat. Her first instinct was to scream, to run, to be the terrified little Omega she had always been. But then, she saw Aldrich's eyes. They were fixed on her, and in them she saw not despair but a fierce, burning pride. He believed in her, and in that single heartbeat, the world shifted. Her fear was burned away by a cold, clear purpose. She would not let Lyra's sacrifice be for nothing. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It rang through the vast, silent hall, clear and true. "He told you Aldrich was weak," she began, her gaze sweeping over the shocked faces of the pack warriors. "He told you our king died at the hands of rogues." She took a step forward, her chin high. "He lied." A gasp went through the crowd. "I was there," she continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "I saw the true Alpha. I saw him share his last piece of food when he was starving. I saw him risk his own life to teach me, an Omega, how to be strong. That is not weakness. That is a king. She then turned her burning gaze on Vorlag. And I have seen this alpha. I saw him order an old woman beaten for the crime of being hungry. I saw him rule not with honor, but with fear. He is not a king. He is a coward, and he is a murderer. The tension broke. The truth, spoken from the mouth of the most powerless wolf in the pack, was more devastating than any blade. The warriors looked at Vorlag, then at the Omega girl, and they saw the lie for what it was. Their loyalty, built on a foundation of fear, crumbled into dust. Vorlag saw it too. His face twisted in a mask of pure rage. He lunged, not at Aldrich, but at her. But in that moment of distraction, Aldrich moved. He surged up, a blur of black fury, his movements no longer clumsy with rage, but precise and deadly. He met Vorlag's charge, and the fight was over before it truly began. It ended not with a roar, but with a quiet, final thud as the usurper fell. In the stillness that followed, the entire pack stared at the fallen tyrant and then at the true Alpha King who stood, breathing heavily, over his defeated foe.
Silence. A deep, profound silence filled the throne room. It was done. Vorlag was defeated. The pack was his. He stood there, the weight of his victory settling on him. He could feel the eyes of every wolf on him, waiting for him to take the throne, to claim his prize. But the throne meant nothing. Not anymore. Without a word, he turned his back on the dais, his gaze finding the one person in the room who mattered. He walked past the shocked faces of his warriors, past the body of his betrayer, and he did not stop until he was standing in front of her. Tessa, his mate, his heart. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. Her skin was soft, real. She was safe. That was all that mattered. He turned to face the pack, his voice ringing with an authority they had not heard in years. "You see this woman?" he declared, his voice filled with a raw, undeniable emotion. "You see this Omega, who you thought was worthless, who you ignored. You are alive tonight because of her courage. You are free tonight because of her strength. Vorlag was defeated by my hand, but he was broken by her heart." He looked back down at her, his golden eyes blazing with a love so fierce it was a physical force. "She is not just my mate," he said, his voice dropping, becoming a vow meant for her, but heard by all. "She is your Luna, and her word is my law." A gasp rippled through the crowd. An Omega, a Luna. It was unheard of. But no one dared to question it. They had all seen it. They had all felt the truth of his words. As the echo faded, the first wolf, an old, scarred warrior, dropped to one knee, then another, and another, until the entire throne room was kneeling. Not just to their Alpha King, but to their Luna.
Her thoughts spun. Luna. The word was a foreign planet, a star she had only ever dared to look at from 1,000,000 miles away. And now, it was her. Aldrich's words wrapped around her, a shield and a crown all in one. She looked out at the sea of kneeling wolves, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel invisible. She just felt seen. The weeks that followed were a blur of change. The mud quarters were torn down, replaced by warm, sturdy new homes. The pack laws were rewritten. Omegas were given a voice on the council for the first time in a generation. The entire world was being remade, not in the image of an alpha's might, but in the shape of an Omega's compassion. But her favorite place was the new infirmary. It was bright and clean and smelled of healing herbs. She wasn't a queen who sat on a throne. She was a Luna who knelt by the bedsides of the sick, who soothed fevered pups, who listened to the troubles of the old. This was where she belonged. One afternoon, as she was changing the bandage on a young hunter's arm, a familiar presence filled the doorway. Aldrich. He didn't enter like a king. He leaned against the doorframe, a soft, weary smile on his face, simply watching her. When she finished, she walked over to him. My king, she said, her voice laced with a gentle tease. My Luna, he murmured, his hand coming up to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His touch still sent a jolt of fire through her. I came to see the heart of our pack. She smiled, her chest aching with a love so deep it was a part of her now. The heart is healing, she said softly. He placed his hand over hers, his fingers warm and strong. He looked around at the peaceful infirmary, at the recovering wolves, at the life she had breathed back into their broken world. Her soul answered him in the quiet between them. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted for the final time, settling into a new, beautiful reality. He was the king, the warrior who had reclaimed his throne. But she was the reason the kingdom was worth saving. The kingdom was safe not because of its alpha's might, but because of its Luna's heart.